Elihu condemns Job. Give ear to me, you who have knowledge, for the ear tests words as the palate tastes food. Let us choose justice for ourselves. Let us know among ourselves what is good, for Job has said, I am righteous. What man is like Job, who drinks scorn like water, who goes in company with the workers of iniquity, and walks with wicked men? For he has said, it profits a man nothing that he should delight in God. If he should set his heart on it, if he should gather to himself his spirit and his breath, all flesh would perish together, and man would return to dust. Listen to the sound of my words. Should one who hates justice govern? Men of understanding say to me, wise men who listen to me, that Job speaks without knowledge. His words are without wisdom. Oh, that Job were tried to the utmost, because his answers are like those of wicked men. For he adds rebellion to his sin, and he claps his hands among us and multiplies his words against God. I will answer you and your companions with you. Your wickedness affects a man such as you, and your righteousness a son of man. Because of the multitude of oppressions they cry out. They cry out for help because of the arm of the mighty. Bear with me a little, and I will show you that there are yet words to speak on God's behalf. I will fetch my knowledge from afar. Indeed, he would have brought you out of dire distress into a broad place where there is no restraint. Listen to this, O Job. Stand still and consider the wondrous works of God. As for the Almighty, we cannot find him. He is excellent in power, in judgment, and abundant justice. He does not oppress, therefore men fear him. He shows no partiality to any who are wise of heart.
We're into still a lot of the speaking of Elihu, and we looked at him last week. We said, it's not just the fact that he's some young guy, the fact is where he was in the maturity of his faith. We're going to continue on. We took some excerpts here, but wisdom literature is a lot of before and after pictures going on. I thought, well, I'm going to give you a test here. I'm going to show you some before and after pictures. And as you look at them, there's something common to all of them. Let's see if you can figure this out. If you bring up our first one, okay, there's a young lady before and then after. Now as we move on, here's the second one. The first one was a lady going into a direction of drugs. The second one here that we bring up is somebody in rehabilitation from drugs. If you continue on, you'll see the next one. It's nothing to do with drugs at all. It has to do with dieting. There's a fellow before he started dieting and after dieting. And then let's see, what do we got next? Okay, here is a young girl in Bangladesh before she was allowed to have the opportunity of education and after she's had the opportunity. The last one is probably the most dramatic. In famine, a baby before being given proper diet and then after. And I asked what's common to all of them. Now, if any of you took Latin in school, just a hint, there's a little motto I put in the bottom just to be cryptic, just to make it, just to give you a hint that's tough. What's common to all those pictures? Transformation, not bad. What did you say over here? Same thing? You're trying to steal his words. Oh, they're trying to steal your glory there, Ron. Transformation is good. Anything else? Say that again, Jennifer. Change is possible. So, yeah, okay, all excellent answers. Anybody translate that little Latin in the bottom by any chance? Yeah, no, I couldn't either. I'll be honest, I Googled it. What's that? Out of the same person. Okay, so, oh, you did. Okay. Oh, just when it looked like you were just so impressive, Mark. But that is absolutely right. It just means out of the same person. There's two big points that when you go from here, I hope you take. And that was one reason I made it hard to decipher this, was this phrase, out of the same person. Isn't it amazing as we look through those pictures, you can take any human being on the planet, and depending on what choices, what direction, what they do in life, can end up in such different places. I was thinking of that even, it's amazing, Chris, of course, did his small sermon in advance. And he showed pictures of one a preacher and the other being a serial killer, looking so much alike. And you know, it could go either way depending on the choices. I mean, where could you be in life, both bad and good, depending on some of the choices you made? So that's what we're getting at, is the before and the after picture can make such a difference. Because you want to know, this is the thing in life, right now you are living your before and after picture. It's in the process of developing. There was before you started into life, and in time there will be the after you have lived your life. And that's a lot of what wisdom literature goes into. And if we take the Old Testament literature, the before and the after that we're finding in Job, and put it in New Testament, Hebrews, not surprising, Hebrews 12, 1 and 2. I'm sure all of you have heard this verse. The before and after is turned into this race we run in life set out before us. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders. Throw off everything that hinders. And the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. Let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus. Do you know about the race marked out for you? Do you know you're even running a race? There's a path that has been set if we'd follow. In the path God sets out, there's the before picture at the starting line. We all start there. And there's the after picture at the finish line, and we will all end there. And there's a whole lot going on in between. A whole lot going on in between. Now, the book of Job is this before and after picture. It's this running the race and the starting line and the finish line. Just think of all the before and after pictures that are in the book of Job that we talked about so far. There was Job before his trials. And then there's Job in his trials, and before we're finished, Job after his trials. There's Job thinking he has it all understood, and then Job after things fall apart. And then there'll be an after that as well when the confusion ends. Job's friends, man, oh man, they had it all figured out. They knew what it was to follow God. There was the before they ran into Job's situation. There's the during, and then there will be the after they tried to solve Job's situation. There's a whole lot of these before and then after pictures going on. We looked at it last week. We talked about the Oregon Trail. Mike Black's convinced I took that picture here in Indiana. I can't convince him that was actually Wyoming. See, there's roads like that everywhere, Mike. Putnam County. But in this trail that we were talking about, we talked about on one rut being the fossilized faith of the old guard, and these guys were weighted down. You know that thing I was talking about in Hebrews, the things that hinder. These guys were hindered by things that they couldn't let go of. And Elihu is another situation, really. His is a broken stride in arrogance. As a matter of fact, tonight, that's the topic. I don't know if you saw that on your bulletin, but tonight we're going to talk about, are Christians arrogant? That should be interesting. All you people who are humble can call in. But anyway, we have Elihu, and his race is being wrecked by his arrogance, and then we have poor old Job is what runners call hitting the wall. Man, he's just suffering and trying to power on through. But this morning, we're just going to consider one of these runners. We're still on Elihu. We're in chapters 34 through 37, and it's really kind of in the heat of the race. And here is Elihu who's just going on. And when you stop and think about it, if we looked at everything Elihu said, he's a sharp young man. He understands a whole lot of stuff about God. So somewhere in his walk, this guy in the race was surging ahead. He's one of these guys that Steve would love to have in his Wednesday night study to come in and sit there, because he was surging ahead, Steve. This guy knew stuff. But somewhere along the line, he got pretty proud of what he knew. And arrogance slips in. And so arrogance has this way of withering growth, because, you know, if you're arrogant, what does that mean? It means I know all I have to know. And so I don't learn anything more. I just stay where I am. And that's kind of where he is in the race. And we see a lot of this. Elihu's in a situation, if we were to look at him as the before and after picture, right now where he is in this middle processing period is he's falling behind in the race and he doesn't even know it. He thinks he knows everything he has to know, and he's falling behind in the race and doesn't even know it. And he raises a question for us before we even go on. Where are you in this race? In the race to grow up. Where are you? Are you at some point where you're surging ahead? Or are you in some point where maybe you're lagging behind? Difficult question. Could you possibly be lagging behind and not even realize it? Is that possible? How does it happen that you lag behind in a race? Well, in a physical race, it comes down to one thing: muscle fatigue. Now, there's a whole lot we could talk about in what causes muscle fatigue, but it comes down to muscle fatigue. Muscles power your legs propel you in the race, and that's how you win or continue in a race, is that was this muscle power. So if the muscles are fatigued, I mean, you're just out of luck. In the race that God sets before us, in the spiritual race that we run, it's another type of fatigue. It's the fatigue of love, the loss of love. When we have love fatigue, there's nothing to power us in the race. And when I say love now, keep in mind, I'm not talking warm and fuzzy. I'm not talking sentimental. I'm talking God's definition of love. Love that believes all things even when it's tough. Hopes all things even when it looks bad. Love that never fails. Love that resolves to look to the welfare of others, to do no harm. Love that puts others ahead of itself. A love that remains a servant even when it's a leader. Love that cares for others even when you don't like them. Boy, that would change a lot of things in life, wouldn't it? We're talking that kind of love, and it's only the type of love, of course, that God can supply. We can't develop that on our own. And in these chapters, Elihu gives us the picture of what it looks like when you're a promising runner, but you suffer love fatigue. And this morning, what I'd like to do in this is just have us look at some of the symptoms and signs. Are you suffering from love fatigue? As have the muscles started to burn too much and not respond? Here's how it looked for Elihu, with things we can look for in ourselves. Consider how this whole thing went. Job has expressed his pain as a godly man, not as somebody whining, as a godly man. Somewhere along the line, Elihu stopped hearing what Job was saying and started making his own scenario. What was Job saying? Well, Job was admitting he was confused in what was going on. He didn't know why he was going through all of this. According to everything he knew in his faith, he wasn't doing anything wrong. He wasn't rebellious in his heart. He was obeying as best as he could. And yet there was all this pain going on. All Job wanted to do is know why. That's where he was. Now, at least Job's friends. Do you remember Job's friends coming? They came from where? Close or far away? Far away. Thank you, somebody remembers chapter 1 as we go in around chapter 37. His friends came from far away, and they came to comfort him. They came with compassion, and because they couldn't address the problem, it turned into kind of a cruel situation, but at least they started from a point of compassion. If we look at Elihu, when he comes into this, there's no warmth in it at all. There's no compassion in it at all. It makes me ask a question. I want to ask you, I'm dead serious, looking for a response on this. If someone knows fine details of the Lord, they know about His majesty, they know that He's omnipotent, omniscient, they know that He's just, they know all these things, but they have never experienced the love of God. It's not in their narrative. Does that person know God? Pam says no. What do you think? Does he know God? Or she? There's something. Knows about God, but doesn't know God. Maybe Ron's nailed it on describing Elihu. That's where we are, because Elihu knows a whole bunch of stuff. But in this loss of empathy, he doesn't even hear what Job is saying. When we look at what's going on here, he's totally changed the situation around. He's distorted the narrative of Job. When I was thinking of this, I was thinking of a place where Kathy and I were, where I taught the first Sunday schools for adults that I had ever taught. Those poor people. But anyway, in this class, I think about this class almost more than any other class or anything I've done. Is we had two Elihus in this class. Kath, I don't know if you remember, two young fellows, very sharp young men. They were big into apologetics. They were big into telling you why God was what He was, defending the Word and all of this. And they were in the back of the class one day and listening to them kind of talk before the class starts. And their great love was the JWs. They love to converse with Jehovah's Witnesses. Apparently they found a large pool of them somewhere. So anyway, one of these young fellows had encountered a new Jehovah's Witness, and he said it was time to lock and load. And I thought, well, that's an interesting way to put it. Maybe his apologetics were dead on. But what gets accomplished when you simply shoot someone, as Bob Bennett would say, with your high-powered doctrine gun? What's really behind that when there's no love at all? What would come of that? Well, the reason I think of these two young men, I've mentioned that part of the story before, but not this part. Eventually, these two young men, they were very sharp, so they catch the eye of church leaders, of course. And they are invited at least this one time to the church board meeting. And it's one meeting I'm glad I wasn't there. I just heard about this later. I had nothing to do with church boards at that time. Not this one anyway. And apparently it just simply reduced into a red-faced screaming match. And it was all around these two young men who thought that apologetics were everything, and I don't know how or what got shared where, but somewhere they just stepped on a whole bunch of toes. There was no love in that room. And that's where good knowledge and no love can take you. It can be a real bad thing. Love hears others. Knowledge can make you deaf. Love hears others. Knowledge can make you deaf. Do you want knowledge? Sure. But there's a reason 1 Corinthians 13:2 says this: if I understand all mysteries and have all knowledge, but have not love, I am. And do you know what the nothing is in Greek, Pam? Sure you do. Nothing. That's what it is. You are a big fat zero. That's something pretty serious considering you know all the mysteries and the knowledge, and you're nothing without this love. The absence of love destroys you in the race. And it leads to this next thing, is the growth of judgmentalism and the lack of forgiveness. The growth of judgmentalism and the lack of forgiveness. This question comes up. We all struggled with this. And we say, well, what's the difference between godly discernment and being judgmental? And the truth is you've got to discern all the time. You discern within the church. You discern outside. Even Pastor Chris's little video was on discernment. There were the serial killer and the pastor. Well, you better be able to discern what you're dealing with there. Discernment and judgmentalism. And you may come up with a lot of your own wise answers on this, but for me, it ultimately came down to this. The one difference between judgmentalism and discernment is love. It comes down to the presence or the absence of love as you are distinguishing between something good or bad. Now, Elihu heard Job through his intellectual filters, but they were pretty loveless. So all he heard when Job was questioning why this was happening to him is, Job, you're scoffing at God. He says that directly. And he's saying, he's hearing when Job says, I see around me that wicked people are doing well. It's an observation that's true, even to this day. Elihu hears, it doesn't matter if you're good or bad. Through the filters he's working with. Everything was in this premise that he was working from. He was like the older guard, too, in the fact he was saying, if you're suffering, you're wicked. If you're wicked, you suffer. If you're suffering, you're wicked. And if you're wicked, then you're doing these things just by a process of deduction. This is what wicked people do. And Elihu takes it even a step further. He says, and wicked people associate with wicked people. So then the loaded judgment on this, even beyond his friends, is, his friend Zophar got as far to say, you deserve even worse, even more punishment. Now Elihu's in this is saying, not only do you deserve more punishment, everyone you love deserves more punishment because they must be wicked too, because wicked people hang out with wicked people. Man, where does this end? Judgmentalism. Just where it is. From Elihu's understanding, it makes perfect sense for Job to suffer. And it would make sense for everybody else to suffer. It was just basic. It was clear as mud. That's the way it should be. The only problem is that's not what God thinks. His assessment was exactly the opposite. I got thinking as I'm thinking of this, to Elihu, it made perfect sense. Here's according to my religion, and I know a lot because I'm a very religious guy. It makes perfect sense, Job, you should be suffering. And everybody you know should be suffering too. Perfect sense, except he's totally wrong. And it made me think of myself. It made me think of other Christians. Have you ever been there where you were so sure you were right? Man, I know this, I am right. only to find out that you were wrong. And you eat crow for a little bit and say, maybe I'm not as smart as I thought I was. Oh, maybe it's only me. I don't know. I see looks that say maybe that's not the case. But for me, it's definitely true. But this leads yet to another thing. The rise, judgmentalism leads to the rise of arrogance. Let me read you something. This was interesting. We said with wisdom literature, the thing about it, we could get into, is Job a real person or not, and all of that stuff. But the point is, no matter what, the writer, the inspired writer in wisdom literature is very deliberate. They are pointing out people, they are making them come across in a certain way. How do you think the writer was trying to make Elihu come across? With phrases like this. Going through his speeches, he says things like, give ear to me, listen to me, listen to the sounds of my words. Wise men who listen to me, I will show you. I will fetch my knowledge from afar. What's your impression of somebody who would start like that in what they're telling you? What was that word? Egotistic. Yeah, egotistical. Yeah, there's an arrogance that's going on. But doesn't that teach us something? If you think of it, if we are in a pattern where it's I want. I'm telling you. I did. I will. I, me, my. Where's the heart? Is it possible we're like Elihu if we're talking in that way? Elihu's in a serious problem in this race we're talking about. He's falling behind. Somebody who uses the same language as Elihu, it's not hard to see they too are falling behind in this race, whether they realize it or not. Arrogance. And that thing of arrogance leads to other symptoms. How about this one? Speaking for God. Speaking for God. Because Elihu says it several times. He's speaking for God. Isn't there a fine line from speaking from God and speaking as God? Ever been somewhere where somebody's teaching or preaching and you go, I'm not sure if I'm hearing someone talking from God or talking as God? Pretty serious indictment going on here with Elihu, because he does it consistently. He says the same thing. Job, I will be your spokesman to God. Surely, I tell you, God will listen to people that are like this. God doesn't listen to people like that. God will help people like this. God doesn't help people. Let me tell you what God does and says. There's a fine line, speaking from God and as God. And every believer has to be careful, not just preachers and not just teachers, but every believer, because there's someone taking a note of what you're saying. Wow, it's a dangerous thing when we start talking as God and not from God. Well, how do I know the difference? Well, generally it's this. You're putting words in God's mouth. Something to be very careful about doing. Speaking as God. And strangely enough, there's another thing that associates with that, and we find it in Elihu. This writing of Elihu is, by the way, just genius. What the writer, of course, why should it surprise us if God tells you to write something? It's going to be genius, right? But another one is a self-conflicted faith, or a self-conflicting faith. We find this more with the other guys. Are fossilized, but Elihu it's interesting. Like he has this main contention that only wicked people really suffer, and yet later on he'll tell you how God's impartial. And he'll say that he's speaking from divine knowledge, and yet he'll go on and say nobody knows God, and they're looking from afar. He says no one can contend or argue with God, and yet he says he'll be a spokesman for Job before God. There's all kinds of things. He's saying one thing and then he's saying something else. Boy, when you're self-conflicted in your faith, you know what? It's kind of like you're in this race and you've tied your shoelaces together. You know, ever run into that situation? Have a prank. I think Mike does that to Jennifer all the time. Does he tie your shoelaces together? And you get up, and of course, one foot fights the other, and you end up on your face. Well, faith will do that. If you're conflicted and you believe things that bang against each other, God is not self-conflicted. It's a sign that we have some work to do when we're like that. When humanity starts reconstructing its own version of God, kind of like Elihu does, it can really start being laughable. It's, this thing of I'm so right and you're so wrong. Or a double standard in things. It may not even be in the faith side of it. It might just be a double standard in how you deal with other people. Isn't it amazing if somebody's obnoxious on the road, they're a jerk? But if you're tearing along on the road, you're just in a hurry? Or the fact if you're saying something you really believe it's absolute truth and somebody else says it and they're just being narrow-minded. There's a lot of ways we can set up and fall into double standards. And it's self-conflicting. It's tying our shoelaces together. That's what Elihu does. It's a major part of the theme of the book. Something to keep in mind. Double standards. They get us nowhere. Now, regardless of what the symptoms are, the real main effect is the tragedy of the Galatians scenario. No matter which symptoms and all of the symptoms we've talked about in the loss of love, they can lead us to this. Galatians 5:7, maybe some of the saddest words that Paul ever wrote. He's writing to the church in Galatia, or in that region. You were running the race so well. You were running the race so well. Who held you back from following the truths? Leads to a final feature in this love fatigue thing. Coming so close and missing the mark. If you look at any of Job's friends, especially Elihu, young fella, really smart, really sharp, knows a whole lot. Once again, someone else, you could put his words on your t-shirt and proudly walk into any church. And yet, he is 180 degrees off from what God thinks and says. He was so close. How did it happen? Because he stopped growing. Somewhere along the line, arrogance took over for knowledge. And he stopped growing. We need to keep growing. Become mature, attaining to the whole measure of the fullness of Christ. Ephesians 4:13. So you're commanded. Becoming mature to the whole measure of the fullness of Christ. That sounds daunting. It sounds like, man, what are you saying? That's too much for any person. But the truth is, we fall into the Job scenario if we don't try to do this, because something will come up in life that where you are, you can't address it. Your faith isn't quite there yet because you're not to the whole measure. I'm not to the whole measure, the fullness of Christ. We have to keep growing no matter what. There's a before and an after picture to this ex item homo that we were saying. It's just profound how people can turn out so differently. The same person, you as a believer, it is amazing from this point in your life, for however long God gives you, how differently you might look at the finish line, depending on where you are in your faith, depending where you are with the loss of love or some of the symptoms we talk about. Elihu's sobering because he makes us ask, where are you seriously in the race right now? In this race to the finish line of growing up in Christ, where are you right now? Are you in a season where you're pushing ahead? You're knowing new things. You're growing in new ways. Or are you lagging behind? Yeah, kind of going through the motions. I mean, it's still in the race, but somewhere way in the back. You know, it's sad. There are even some folks who show up at the track and never really get in the starting blocks, get going. It's enough just to be there at the track. No, where are you in the race? How are you actually doing? Because I guarantee you that as we look at Job, as we look at the New Testament, we see we are all before and after pictures in the making right now.